In the first of these videos, we saw that Nietzsche's man with a lantern is not so much exercised by the fact that God is dead itself, but with the consequences of the death of God. And so what I want to do in this video is to pick up on 5 of the most important of those consequences and talk about each of them a little bit. We're going to talk about morality, language, truth, humanity, and the author, and what happens to each of those things once God is dead. Let's start with morality. One of the most famous quotes about the death of God isn't actually a quote at all. It's given as a quote from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and people usually quote the words, if God is dead, then everything is permitted. Sort of what it says in The Brothers Karamazov, but those words never appear, and it's not exactly what is said. So let's work from what Dostoevsky does actually say, what he puts in the mouth of one of his characters, Ivan Fyodorovich. Ivan Fyodorovich added in parentheses that the whole natural law lies in that faith. He's talking about faith in God, faith in immortality. And that if you were to destroy in mankind the belief in immortality, not only love, but every living force maintaining the life of the world would at once be dried up. Moreover, nothing then would be immoral. Everything would be lawful, even cannibalism. What this quotation is getting at is that the death of God requires a whole rethinking of the basis and foundation of our morality. Because in the terms of this passage, if there's no immortality, if there's no final reckoning, final judgment, final verdict passed on the things we do in this life, then there's really no basis upon which we can say that some of them were acceptable or good and others were evil. I may have one opinion, you may have another opinion, but really without immortality, it's very hard to get any substantial sense of these things to stick. So that doesn't mean there can't be any morality at all, and we'll be coming back to this over the weeks. It means that there can't be the sort of morality that we've had until now. We can't continue thinking about ethics in the way we have previously. We've got to rethink it. Now, we might end up with something that we call ethics, and it might work for us, but we can't go on as we have been in relation to morality. The second consequence of the death of God is in relation to language, and here we look at something that Nietzsche himself says in his book called The Twilight of the Idols. It's a very strange, very enigmatic sentence. He says, I'm afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. What on earth could he mean? What has God got to do with grammar? Well, think about the God of the Bible. All the way back to Genesis 1. God is a speaking God, isn't he? God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God speaks in a particular way. His words correspond perfectly to reality. God says, let there be light, and there's light. There's not something else instead. His words are effective. They produce things in the world, and they produce the world itself. And his words correspond to things in the world. You know, when he says, let there be this or that, that is exactly what there is. And that gives us a pattern for understanding the relationship between language and the world. God, the Logos, as John calls him in the prologue to his gospel, underwrites the effectiveness of language. And therefore, when we speak language, when we have our little logoi, we participate or we benefit from this God-given correspondence between words and things. Not that our words correspond to things in the same way that God's do. We can be mistaken, we can misspeak, but still there's a fundamental principle that language and reality are related to each other, that there's a correspondence between them. There's a sense, in other words, that the structure of our language reflects the structure of our world. But if you just think about that for a moment, it's not as obvious as it might seem. We take air into our lungs and blow it out, producing particular sounds. And we assume that these sounds produce some sort of authoritative take on the world outside our heads. The more you think about it, the more curious it is that we should assume that there's a necessary correspondence between our language and the world, that our language speaks truly and reveals the way that the world really is to us. Of course, if there's no God, if there's no principle of correspondence, then we can't be sure that there is any relation between our language and the world. We can think that there is, but that might just be a relation created by our language, not a relation that was there waiting to be discovered by our language. We simply can't know if there's no God. Third consequence of the death of God is in relation to truth. This is Nietzsche again. In his piece Truth and Lies in an Extra-Moral Sense, another very famous Nietzsche passage where he talks about truth directly. Let me read it. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical and binding. Truths are illusions, which we've forgotten are illusions. They're metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. So what he's saying here in a nutshell is that we think that our language just points out truth that's already there in the world. But actually, for Nietzsche, our language produces that truth by making correspondences that aren't necessarily there in the world at all. They're just there in language, but we've forgotten that language is doing this work. We've forgotten that it's language bringing things together, making comparisons, creating metaphors. In fact, we've forgotten that things are metaphors at all. And so what we have is language doing a lot of work for us, but we're thinking that language is just transparently telling us about the world outside, that language is just inert and passive, that it's not language itself that's making all the links, joining the dots, creating truth, but it's simply recognizing the way that truth already is in the world. The fourth consequence of the death of God is for humanity. Let's listen to André Malraux, writing in 1926, French author and statesman. For you, he says, people of the Western world, absolute reality was first God, then man. But man is dead, following God. And you search with anguish for something to which you can entrust this strange heritage. Your minor attempts to construct a moderate nihilism do not seem destined to long life. So it seems that for Malraux there's some sort of link between the death of God and the death of man or humanity afterwards. And so the question we need to ask, of course, is why should one necessarily follow the other? Why can't man survive God? Well, think about the way that humanity has traditionally been thought about in the Western tradition. Let's take the religious route. Genesis 1, humanity is made, men and women are made, in the image of God. So in order to know what men and women really are, what their identity is, what their essence is, you've got to look to God. Because God is the original, and men and women are in his image, whatever precisely that means in Genesis 1. Or think about the Renaissance or the medieval world, where there's an idea of a correspondence between what they call the microcosm and the macrocosm. The macrocosm is the order that God put in the universe, God's ordered creation, his ordered world. Everything is in its rightful place, the stars, the sun, the moon, the planets, the seasons are regular. That's the macrocosm. The microcosm is humanity. Human beings are ordered, and structured and predictable in the same way that the order in the universe is. Now, by the time you got to the 19th century, the idea of a neat, sort of compact, ordered universe has gone out of the window. It's now an infinitely expanding, chaotic, cold, vast universe. So we haven't really got a macrocosm anymore. So now we can no longer correspondingly have the microcosm because they fitted together. So all the notions that we have for understanding what humanity is and how human beings fit in the universe aren't there anymore by the 19th century. And so in 1966, 40 years after Marot, Michel Foucault can write in his book The Order of Things, Les mots et les choses in French, a famous little passage right at the end of the book, where he says, man is an invention of recent date and perhaps one that is reaching its end. What on earth does Foucault mean? What he doesn't mean is that soon there are no longer going to be any human beings anymore. Now, for reasons that we're going to explore in week 6 of the course and that I'm not going to go into now, he thinks that man is an idea that emerged in the modern age. He's particularly thinking about the idea of human beings thinking of themselves as a locus of representation, as looking out onto the world, as us that are doing the seeing and feeling and touching and thinking as something that needs to be thought about itself. It's that idea of man. Again, more on that in week 6, but that's just a tiny little sketch now. That idea of man actually only came to be in the modern age, roughly after Immanuel Kant. And Foucault thinks that that age is now on its last legs, and so this idea of man is on its last legs. You put Marot and Foucault together, what do you get? There used to be some idea of man as eternal and changing, an essence, it's the image of God, it's the microcosm. When God goes, that goes. And so now you've got a sort of a makeshift idea of humanity, different ideas of man coming in and going out as time goes by, no longer a fixed, unchanging idea of what humanity is, no eternal category of man anymore. Our final consequence of the death of God is in relation to the author. And here we turn to the French theorist, Roland Barthes. You can tell that he's French from the picture on the left because there he is smoking a cigar. And all French theorists from the middle of the 20th century seem to have smoked one thing or another. So we know he's French. And in 1968, he publishes an incredibly important, relatively brief article called The Death of the Author. And towards the end of that article, he says the following. I'm reading from the screen. We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant antiphrastal recriminations of good society in favour of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers or destroys. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Now, what does Barthes mean? He doesn't mean, obviously, that people should no longer write books, that there should no longer be any authors. The clue to what he means is the capital A at the beginning of author, on the final line of this quotation on the screen. What we need to see an end of, according to Barthes, is not people writing books. It's the idea of the author in as far as the author is the origin and explanation of her or his own text. The author as the final appeal of what the text actually means. So when the author's told you what the text means, that's it. Everybody else must shut up and just listen to the author. In other words, it's the death of the author as supreme authority. And here we can see really strong echoes of the death of God. Think back to Dostoevsky. If God is dead, everything is permitted. What Barthes is saying is that if the author is dead, all interpretations are permitted. God was the origin and explanation of the universe with final authority over it. If God said something, that's what it was. If God says something was good, it was good. If God says something was evil, it was evil. And in that sense, he was acting like an author on the traditional view over the text of the universe. If God said something, well, that's what it was. If the author said something, then that's what the text meant. But if we no longer have a God who acts in that way in relation to the universe, then Barthes is saying we really ought not to have an author who acts in that relation to the text anymore. If there's no God, then the author can't play God in relation to her or his text. And therefore the price to pay for what he calls the birth of the reader, the empowerment, if you like, of the reader in terms of the interpretations they might want to give to the text, the price to pay for that is getting rid of this idea of the capital A author, the author with ultimate authority over their work. So then, to conclude, the death of God leaves in its wake a culture in which goodness and truth and beauty are up for grabs in a way that they hadn't been for millennia previously. It leaves a culture in which morality and truth and language and humanity and the author have to be negotiated, can't be taken for granted anymore. We've got to find new ways of thinking what these things might mean, because the old ways, following Nietzsche, are not legitimate anymore. We're cheating, we're being hypocritical if we get rid of God and try and keep hold of all these other ideas that rely on God in exactly the same way as we were using them previously. So the challenge for Western culture and Western thought following Nietzsche is to find new ways of thinking, to find new ways to come to terms with a reality that doesn't have God underwriting it and structuring it anymore. How to think of truth and goodness and beauty in ways that don't rely on God, and trying to work out what sort of truth and what sort of goodness and what sort of beauty you might end up with if you try and think them without God. Now, Derrida and Foucault are not the first to take up this challenge after Nietzsche, but they certainly do provide two of the most important attempts to come to terms with some of these things that we saw in the 20th century, and two of the most important with ongoing influence and importance today. In the following weeks, we're going to look at what Derrida and Foucault say in some detail, and we're going to be looking at how to think of what they say from a biblical or Christian point of view. But for now, what I invite you to do is to reread the Madman Parable to make sure it's fresh in your mind, and then to add your comments and your questions, your reflections, your likes, even feel free to upload pictures, whatever you want to do, in the space at the bottom of this page, and we will get this discussion going. So then, it's over to you, and thank you very much indeed for listening.